Hello and welcome to our third Access Chat of 2021. We're delighted to welcome back to the show Andy Imparato in a new role. Not terribly new to him, but new to us. So last time Andy was here, it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and he was at AUCD, and he's now at Disability Rights California, and he's joined by his colleagues Tho Vinh and Eric Harris. So great to have all of you with us. Obviously, California is the proud home of a new vice president of the United States. I'm sure we'll come to that topic shortly. But some of the things that I know that DRC are doing right now, topics around covering disability rights, disability justice, looking at voting rights and census and understanding the disability community. So welcome to the show. Andy, if you'd like to recap for our guests a bit about who you are, and then Tho and Eric, if you could do the same, that would be fantastic.
Sure, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Debra and Tony, for having me back. I really appreciate the opportunity. So I'm a disability rights lawyer. I moved back to my home state of California in January of last year after 26 years in DC doing national disability advocacy and policy work. I have lived experience with bipolar disorder, and it's been quite a first year in California. We had record wildfires, we have the pandemic, it's been a challenging year in a lot of ways, but it's also been extraordinary. And one of the things that's made it so extraordinary for me is getting to work with Tho and Eric. So I'm delighted that they're both joining me. They both are lawyers like me at Disability Rights California, and we're all working together to try to engage the disability community in a more proactive way, and we're having a lot of fun doing it.
Thank you. Tho?
Hi, so Tho Vinh, I'm so excited to join you this morning for me. So I'm an Asian American woman. I'm a refugee from Vietnam, and I've been with Disability Rights California for a good 20 years, and very excited. I'm a person with a visual disability and a refugee, and I live intersectionally as well. So very fortunate to be in California, where that, for the most part, is supported, right? We've lived through some darker times, so it's a good time to celebrate all of our diversity. So I'm very excited to join you on this show and looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent, thank you. And Eric?
Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Harris. I am an African-American man, and I also have a disability. I was born with congenital hip dislocation, which gave me nerve damage in my left hip, left knee, left ankle, left foot and right ankle. And so I am a wheelchair user, a proud wheelchair user. I've spent most of the early part of my career in Northern California, but in politics in Sacramento, California, in the Bay Area with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who represents Berkeley and Oakland, California, as well as in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, working for Barbara Lee there, as well as the American Association for People with Disabilities, and other nonprofit organizations like the NAACP of California. And mostly I'm a policy wonk. I really care about policy, public policy, government, and politics, and creating laws that help people in marginalized communities like African Americans and people with disabilities. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today.
That's fantastic. And I think we're all equally interested in the topics of intersectionality. I spent the last couple of years working closely with our Chief Diversity Officer in my day job. Both of us trying to make sure that disability is seen as a key part of our diversity as an organization and in the wider diversity movement. And I think that quite often we think about these things in silos, and so and disability is the one thing that is totally intersectional and totally transversal. So I'm really pleased that this is a topic today. So obviously so much going on in the news at the moment, especially in the US, and the change in administration has also brought about a change in approach, very visible change in approach to disability. It's clear with the signing during the swearing in ceremony, the overnight change in the accessibility of whitehouse.gov. All of these things are sending a really clear signal that the new administration is walking the talk on accessibility, but you've been much more engaged in sort of the rights and the stuff going on in the background, and particularly sewing, if I'm right, you did work on the census and stuff like that, and that really feeds into voting rights and impacts, maybe less in California, because California is pretty blue, pretty heavily swayed towards Democrat, but in other parts of the country, that's been really an issue, and voter rights, voter participation, and the denial of access to the ability to vote have been really red button issues during this election and previously. So very interested if you could tell us a bit about your work on that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. Yeah, so in speaking about intersectionality, I'll start with the census. In our 2010 census, really the state didn't involve people with disabilities, right? So in the 2020 census, I was so fortunate to be appointed a governor appointee to the 2020 Census Committee. And on that body, what I was very intentional in doing is to ensure that disability was represented and how intersectional disability was. So, and I think folks here would understand this, is that oftentimes, even with progressive organizations that are left-leaning, don't oftentimes think about disability when they think about diversity, right? And that's really unfortunate, because if you look at disability, we span all race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth, right? So that's been the ongoing battle, is ensure that we can inject and make sure that disability is at the table wherever we are. So what we were able to do in the 2020 census is that they didn't do any meaningful outreach in the 2010. So we brought in, as part of that committee, I was able to bring in other partners, including DREDIV, Disability Rights and Education Defense Fund, including CFILC, the California Foundation of Independent Living Centers, to ensure that they helped to spread the message. We were able to get funding, help to assist them in getting funding, so then they can actually do outreach to the disability community itself. And then we ensured to get disability information connecting the census. So it informs the Electoral College and numbers, and we know how important that is, right? The Electoral College numbers, it informs congressional numbers, right? But it also informs $1.5 trillion US dollars, $1.5 trillion in how services are funded through the federal funding. And so that what means for the nation, but also for California, is Medicaid funding, right? A lot of people with disabilities are in need of that. It informs special ed funding, it informs housing, it informs emergency services, it informs all aspects. So not engaging the disability communities at its intersection was a disservice all around to all of Californians. So I was just very intentional in ensuring that that particular population and its intersectionality was lifted and accounted for through the whole steps of the 2020 census.
Well, and sewing, I also just want to point out that sewing was on that committee with civil rights leaders from lots of other communities. So she comes out of that experience with all of those relationships, and they come out of that experience with a relationship with sewing, who's now a Sherpa for them to the disability community. So there's a lot of side benefits of this kind of engagement.
That's right. So that we can then enter other spaces. So when the work I'm shifting towards now is redistricting. So census data is used to determine district line and apportionment, right? So I'm finding myself in the exact same spot again, very similar to census, where disability is not at the table. So as the state determines how lines are drawn, I want to ensure that people with disabilities have access to go to those spaces, to be able to give input. So that's what I'm doing now. So in California, we're very intentional ensuring that when people vote, there's a machine that's accessible, that the places they go to are accessible. So there's that ongoing conversation and dialogue. But throughout the whole step, the census, voting, and redistricting, they're all connected, and that it allows people with disabilities across the racial, ethnic, spectrum to have the same civic, duties, and that to actually express and be able to do everything that everyone else does, so that their voice is counted as well.
And the other thing that happened this week is the California Department of Public Health, which is the lead agency for vaccine deployment in California, they reached out to us because they're trying to follow the outreach strategy they used with the census to try to communicate with people about the benefit of vaccines. So again, I just feel like there's a lot of benefit to the whole disability community when we engage on these broader issues.
Right. And if disability was not part and at the table for census, it would not have come up potentially with the vaccination. It may not have come up potentially with other arenas, because the state was involved in how census information and outreaching was happening, right? And because we were able to give input related disability, there's been benefits, as Andy has pointed to, other realms that we didn't even think about. At that point, we were just making sure everyone with a disability in California were counted. Who knew that structure was then be used again and again, including in vaccination? So we were very fortunate in that way.
Obviously, the thing that you mentioned around districting and boundaries, that's a key part of determining who stays in power. We've seen it in my own country, where the redrawing of electoral boundaries has tilted the advantage to one party or another over decades, where essentially, because we have a first past the post system, which it works in a similar way to a certain extent to the electoral college, in that each area sends its representative. That means that like in California, which is very significantly democratic in its leanings, there isn't this kind of proportional representation, and the districting boundaries can make a huge difference, and therefore really have a disproportionate impact on policy and governance and all of the rest of it. And so the intervention of lawyers like yourself, Eric and Andy, working on the sort of the fundamentals of the structure of how we vote, how we are represented, is really important. I know Antonio had a question, and Debra's got some follow-ups as well.
No, I had a question that was going to a different direction, but I think there's another element that I would like to put in. So here we are talking about census and the elections, but what are our views in terms of the main political entities putting individuals from different intersections up to the list to be elected? Because that's an important part of the representation. I would like to see your views, why the Democrats, the Republicans are not putting more people forward to represent their communities. Why is that?
Eric, do you want to go first on that one?
Yes, I can take that one. So Sewing just finished talking about civic engagement and the importance of the behind the scenes. Voting, of course, is a lot of the front line, and elected officials are part of the front lines. And then Sewing spoke about the census and redistricting and kind of how that creates power in the United States and around the world. And I think that your point that it's important for Democrats, Republicans to also have people with disabilities, people with different backgrounds, and people of intersectional identities represented in the front lines when we're talking about running for office and actually making policy decisions. I think that part of that, it's a two-way street, so to speak. I think a big part of that is on the leadership of these parties. A lot of our leaders, just like around the world, are getting older. Our entire society is getting older. So you have a lot of people in political power in the United States who are getting in their 80s. I know that a lot of people were recently speaking in this recent election about both candidates being in their 70s and how much that has changed over the years, how in years past we might have had candidates in their 50s and 60s. And I think that another part of that is on the disability community to recognize its leaders and to have individuals within the disability community step up to the plate, so to speak, and make sure that we take advantage of opportunities and run for office, even if they do not reach the level of governor or president yet. At this time, we can still run for city council, we can still run for school board and have an impact on our specific communities, because in the United States, just as around the world, our local elected officials really are the ones who make a huge difference in everyday life. They're the ones who are able to make minor changes as far as every day, but major changes when it comes to folks who have to navigate some of these systems, folks who have to navigate their school system with special education here in the United States. So I think that it's really, really important for leaders like Andy, like Sewing, and like myself to do our part to find disability leaders throughout the state of California in specific ways for us, but really throughout the country. And then for those leaders to really step up and take on the challenge of running for political office and making the changes that we all want to see.
If I could just do a quick follow-up, a great example of the power of that lived experience in a politician, to me, is Tammy Duckworth. Tammy Duckworth is a United States Senator from Illinois who is in President Obama's former Senate seat. She's a disabled Iraq war veteran. And our House of Representatives, when the Republicans still had control of it, passed a law that would have weakened our civil rights law, would have weakened the Americans with Disabilities Act. And when it went over to the Senate, Tammy Duckworth got so upset that the House had passed a law that weakened the civil rights of Americans with disabilities that she reached out personally to every senator, and she created a letter where a majority of the Senate was on record saying they would never support that bill. And she did that quickly, and that was like force of personality for her as a senator. So, I mean, she wears that mantle. She's an American hero. She's a veteran. She's a woman of color, woman with a disability. So she wears all of those identities with grace. And to me, we need more leaders like Tammy Duckworth.
And Andy, if I remember correctly, she also brought her baby. Wasn't she the one that was nursing?
Yeah, she's the first. Yeah, she's the first United States senator to have two babies while she was in the Senate, and she brought her baby with her down to the Senate floor and changed the rules on the Senate floor. She's definitely a role model and a trendsetter in lots of ways.
I'm such a huge fan of her. And I love this topic. And I also, I think, a lot of people understand outside the US, just like any other country, our laws are so complicated. And so that's why we really need lawyers with disabilities fighting for us. We need the lawyers that understand the complexity. Census, what's the census? It's just, no, it's redistricting. It's this, it's a huge deal. And we all have to come out. It's also so exciting to see what one person can accomplish. We talked about Tammy. You look what Sewing's doing. I mean, my goodness, Eric now, he's about to be a lawyer now that he's graduated. It's so empowering, and representation matters so much. But I would like just to dig in a little bit to why do we need, because I certainly have an opinion about this, why do we need organizations like Disability Rights of California? Now, in the United States, I'm going to let Andy correct me, we have disability rights in all states or most of our states, but it's like our states, every state is different. And I believe that Disability Rights of California is the one that's the biggest that I see more impact coming from them. But I was just wondering if you'd explain that a little bit so that maybe others outside the US could sort of translate it to theirs. But also, I'm not sure that all Americans understand what you are doing and why it's so important too.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Deborah. Our organization is part of a national network. Every state and US territory has a federally funded legal services agency for people with disabilities. We call them protection and advocacy agencies, and they were created over 40 years ago in response to an expose that Geraldo Rivera did on an institution in New York called Willowbrook, where people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were being warehoused. And he went in and exposed the human rights violations that were happening in that institution. And the country was so disgusted by what he put on television and showed them, that they passed a law to create the first protection and advocacy agencies. And initially we were focused on protecting and advocating for people with developmental disabilities like the folks in Willowbrook. And then over time, our mission has broadened. So now we serve people with all types of disabilities and all ages. And I guess, Deborah, what I would say in terms of why do we need these organizations, you could make the argument that we should put ourselves out of business, right? Like if our country would embrace all of these civil rights laws and the government would enforce them well, then we don't need these private sector non-governmental organizations doing the work that we're doing at Disability Rights California. But as you know, Deborah, the government is not big enough to enforce the civil rights of people with disabilities everywhere that our rights are being violated. We're not in every classroom, we're not in every workplace. And really, we don't want the government to be in all these places necessarily. So, I think the goal with an organization like Disability Rights California is to make sure that the laws are implemented and enforced, make sure that people are held accountable when they violate people's civil rights, and make sure that people know their rights. A lot of what we do is just educating parents about the rights of children in classrooms, educating adults with disabilities about their rights to transportation, housing, employment, you name it. So to me, it's a beautiful thing. The government makes an investment. We often sue the government. The government does not punish us for suing them. And this is how we hold institutions accountable. Like we sued the California Department of State Hospitals because people are dying in state hospitals for people with mental health disabilities. And the Department of State Hospitals funds us, and they're still funding us even though we're suing them. So I appreciate that the government at the state level and the federal level want to have a robust, independent advocate for people with disabilities that has the power to take the government to court on behalf of people with disabilities.
And I will just jump in and say one more thing. I know that the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I live, also sued the government, and or I should say that that's not correct. Well, our leader stepped up, our disability leader stepped up and took it to the Department of Justice, and actually the Department of Justice came for the Commonwealth of Virginia and won. And so we had to make a bunch of changes in Virginia, which we desperately needed. And so, and another thing I would just want you and your team to comment on, I don't know if Sewing or Eric or you want to comment on this, but unfortunately, disability rights are not, they're not the same in every single state, but all the states aren't the same, right? But at the same time, I know families, as a reminder, I have a daughter with Down syndrome. Sadly, my husband has very late stage dementia, but I know families that have moved to different states because they weren't getting the right supports. I know so many families. They're just like, okay, well, I got to move to California. So I was just wondering if Eric Sewing or Andy, y'all wanted to just talk about that a little bit, and then let me turn it back over to Neil or Antonia.
Sewing, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so thanks for that, Deborah. Yeah, so we in California, we're so fortunate to have what's called the Lanterman Act. Lanterman Act doesn't exist anywhere else in the nation and probably even the world. So people do come to California for the services, and the Lanterman Act provides services for people with developmental disabilities like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, seizure disorders, intellectual disabilities, from birth to death, essentially. And so it's, and I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it didn't come about magically. It didn't come about because government agencies suddenly saw the light of day, and it came about because people fought for it. People fought hard. People did all that they could. They were marching out in the streets, protesting, working with their government officials to make sure things are signed. So all the benefits that we have, all the laws that we have in the books that are protective and that advocate for people with disabilities, we do it on the shoulders of folks who dedicated a life and sacrificed their life so that the next generation. So we're very fortunate to have the Lanterman Act to ensure that people with developmental disabilities can live full, inclusive lives, but also
Sewing,
Yeah.
you've given kind of the glass half full answer to Deborah's question, but I want to give the glass half empty. Debra, California is ridiculously expensive. The inequality in this state is ridiculous. Okay, so Sewing is right. We have this beautiful law, the Lanterman Act, that creates an entitlement for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who qualify under that law. But we also have housing that nobody can afford. We just have serious problems in this state. The homelessness issue in this state is like probably nowhere in the world, certainly nowhere else in the United States has as many homeless people as we do, not even close. So Sewing's right. We have beautiful laws. We fought hard for them. But my goal at Disability Rights California is to make California the best state in the country for people with disabilities. And there are measurements that would attach to that goal: labor force participation rates, poverty rates, home ownership rates, high school graduation rates. We are not leading the country in any of those. So as much as Sewing is correct, and we do have a generous state government, a progressive state government, we still have a long way to go in terms of really getting the outcomes that we all know are possible.
Yeah. So I think, we, even those of us that don't live inside the US, observe what happens in terms of Silicon Valley and the impact of the tech industry on housing prices and the effect that has on inequalities. And I think that one of the things that really has come out of the COVID crisis has been the impact of inequality and poverty on people's health outcomes as well. So I know before we came on air, we were talking about the way that stuff has been implemented in the US in terms of you didn't have any global oversight as such, which is now being implemented. But can you tell us a little bit more about your work to help make sure that the disability community is considered fully in the vaccination programs that you can influence, and some of your experience of the impacts of the crisis so far?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll mention two things, and then Sewing and Eric, feel free to chime in. We've advocated strongly that our hospitals, especially in the Los Angeles area right now, do not punish people with disabilities and people who are older when they're implementing healthcare rationing. Our state had a proposal that we successfully changed, where they were going to say it was okay to not give somebody access to a ventilator based on their age or based on their underlying disability. And we convinced the state that that was discriminatory and illegal under our civil rights laws, and that the only thing you should be thinking about when you're trying to decide who gets the ventilator is, will it help keep them alive? And if you start thinking about their quality of life after they're kept alive, that gets you into discriminatory territory very quickly. It's not just disability and age. It can also lead to racial discrimination based on body type. I mean, there's a lot of ways that can lead to discrimination. So we're still working hard on that. And obviously that's not self-enforcing. We have to be out there making sure that the discrimination is not occurring. We also are trying to get people with disabilities who are under 65 lifted up as a priority category for vaccination. I was mentioning I'm on the California Community Vaccine Advisory Committee. There's 5 of us on there who are allied around these issues. And we're pushing the state very hard right now to make sure that a 50-year-old with Down syndrome in a group home who's at huge risk of getting COVID and dying from COVID would have at least the same prioritization as a healthy 65-year-old living in their apartment on the beach and having no increased risk of getting COVID. To us, that's like common sense, but you wouldn't believe how hard it's been to get the state to adopt that position. But Sewing or Eric, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, what I'll add is that I think sometimes what we're all fighting against is people's potentially subconscious unawareness of the value of a disabled person. So folks in power make decisions that have detrimental impact on people with disabilities without understanding, because there's an underlying disvaluing of disabled lives. So there has to be, that's why we've got to be in every conversation, everywhere we are, to ensure that disabled lives matter and to lift that.
Eric, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think you guys covered pretty much all of it, but just the recognition that all marginalized communities are really fighting for this. A lot of African Americans and a lot of Latinos have died because of this virus. And a lot of them have been older people, but a lot of them have also been people with disabilities as well, across the board. And so we're really thankful to have Andy on the commission that he's on, because he's able to impact lives. He's able to save lives because of his voice, and because of the decisions made by this committee. So we're hopeful that this committee, that everybody who is in a decision-making position is able to make the right decisions with courage and step up for people who do not necessarily have a voice here, and who have been dying and getting very sick because of this virus. So we're really, really thankful.
One of the topics that has been got some quite interest from different companies is the role of the Chief Diversity Officer. I came across, I worked for a company in 2008, and that was the first time that I came across with someone appointed for such a role. And at that time, the focus was pretty much in terms of geographic diversity, cultural diversity, bringing all employees together, working for the company, and giving somehow everyone the same type of opportunities in terms of leadership roles. That was the main topic. We've seen many changes since then, and I've seen in the last 3 years many companies hiring someone to the role of Chief Diversity Officer. But sometimes I see that they look at diversity as an HR program, not as something that they build in the overall culture of the organization. And there's another thing that I also know is sometimes it goes by trends. Okay, now we are focused on gender. Now we are focused on another group, and so on. There's always a very partial look to kind of a moment in time that somehow follows the what the audience are talking about or what the media is talking about. So I would like to see of your views. How can we build a consistent diversity? How can we build this in a more consistent way, where all the groups are included, and we can do a better job employing people, particularly people with disabilities?
I guess I'll take a quick shot, and then I'd love for Sewing and Eric to chime in. To me, the chief diversity officer of any organization needs to be the CEO. If the CEO does not understand the importance of all types of diversity, then they are not going to be able to attract and retain the best possible people for every position in the organization. And I gave a glass half empty answer to the California question. Now I'll give a glass half full. Satya Nadella at Microsoft wrote a book about kind of refreshing Microsoft's culture. And he attributed his lived experience as a parent of 2 children with disabilities as literally helping Microsoft rediscover its soul. That's the way he put it. And he said that his experience as a parent helped him develop empathy, which was the word that he saw as the critical thing that he needed to have and his leadership team needed to have in order for Microsoft to be the best possible employer and to be the most successful technology company that it could be. So I think it's fine to have chief diversity officers, but if the CEO is not 100% with that person, then it's a check the box position. It almost doesn't matter how you define diversity. It's just not going to have a big impact. But Sewing or Eric, anything you want to add?
Yes, I'd like to respond kind of from the experience of being an employee at DRC. We have, over the last 6 months or so, really embraced our diversity, in particular with its employees. I would say that we have really looked internally. And one of those things that we've done is we have created employee resource groups, which essentially um, um, allow employees within DRC to be a part of smaller groups that are part of our cultural identities, our gender identities, and our disability identities. So, for instance, I am a part of the Disabilities ERG, which is an employee resource group. I'm a part of the African American Employee Resource Group. And there are other employee resource groups for Asian and Pacific Islanders, for those who identify as Latino, for those who identify as LGBTQIA+. And not only do we get an opportunity to discuss issues or discuss issues within our work environment and outside of our work environment, but we also get a seat at the table of leadership. Andy, as he said, really believes and really empowers all of the staff. And he is the one who leads the way when it comes to having a diverse mindset, making sure that everybody feels included and a part of the solution. And so each ERG at Disability Rights California has an opportunity to speak to leadership often and give our perspectives on how we are doing at work, and what we are looking for in terms of ways that we can be assisted, trainings that we can offer to the rest of the organization, or ways that we can find people outside of the organization who can give trainings. So it's really a great environment to work. And part of the movement at Disability Rights California is making sure that we're a model employer for people with disabilities and for all employers in every aspect of business and every aspect of nonprofit work, political work. We're trying to do our part to show others how it should be done. And it's not just from an HR perspective, it's all the way from the very top of the organization and filters throughout the organization so that everybody feels empowered and comfortable being exactly who they are and representing the identities that they represent.
And I'm gonna be the flip side, Andy, and be the kind of cup half empty here. And I want to just remind folks, the listeners, and that it took deaths to even have this current conversation. So it took George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, and oftentimes Black bodies, that they had to die so that there's not only this national conversation, but international conversation. So we want to get to a point where no one has to die for us to have these conversations. These conversations benefits all of us. These conversations, equity and equality benefits everyone. No one is lost for it, right? So what I hope, and I'm a hopeful person, anyway, that we come to a point where internally we come from a place where we want well for us, we want well for others, so that bottoms up, top down, we're going to do the right thing because the right thing benefits everyone in all sectors.
Excellent, well said. I got a couple of comments, and this has been a fascinating conversation, and unfortunately it's gone way too quickly. So we'll definitely need to have you back again, because I think we only touched on a couple of topics out of many that we could go down the rabbit hole on here. But when you said that people have died in order for the law to change, actually people have been dying for a long time. What was different was that people had died in public, on camera, on the internet. And that was what made people take notice. So so that brings me on to my closing point about representation and you know, going full circle to talk about intersectionality and you know, the change of leadership in the US over the last couple of days, you know, we had a representative of an intersectional community, you know, doing the inauguration poem. So we had Amanda Gorman from California, from your district, Eric, you know, who is both a person of color and also has an invisible disability representing the country. So I think that visible representation really matters. Is super important. You know, I was gratified to see it. So, you know,
and Neil,
yeah.
Don't forget that she had a disability that's very similar to the disability of the person who was getting inaugurated as president of the United States. So it's kind of a beautiful thing. You have an older person who had a stutter as a child that helped shape his character and identity, lifting up a 22-year-old who the First Lady, Jill Biden, had seen perform and was blown away by for obvious reasons. So I just love that combination. It's not just the young woman of color, but it's the older man who sees the connection.
Yeah. And I would add, I love that she speaks about it in positivity. Yes. Right? Oftentimes disability is spoken about something that makes you lesser. It made her more. You know, and in the interviews you see her, and you know, she speaks of like how it helps to shape her, how she's grateful for it. So that's been a really helpful conversation to have as well.
And I've heard Greta Thunberg do the same thing when she talks about her autism. So I feel like we've got a generation of young women who are literally ready to take over the world, and they're using their lived experience with disabilities in a positive way. It's very exciting.
Yeah. Oh, and you know, talking of Greta, before I must say she throws shade in a way that no one else does, because she waits to, you know, to the perfect moment and then responds and plays back Donald Trump beautifully. So I love Greta. I need to also share my love for the people that keep us on air, which are Barclays Access, MyClearText, and Microlink, because their support means that we can support the rest of the community. So thank you so much today. It's been a real pleasure. We really look forward to you joining us on Twitter for what's going to be a very rich conversation.
And before we stop recording, can we just celebrate that we have new presidents and a wonderful vice president? I forget where the vice president's from. Do y'all remember? Eric? Yeah. Let's just celebrate just for one quick minute about, and I think, Eric, you have a background in your family background. So could we just for one quick second talk about that, and then we'll jump off?
Absolutely. So I am proud to be born. I was born in Berkeley, California, which is in the East Bay area. My family, I have a godfather who is the former mayor of Oakland, Elihu Harris, and he is also a former assembly member in the state legislature, representing the East Bay area. And so we are so proud being in Northern California, representing the Bay Area. And she doesn't just represent the Bay Area, as most people now know of Silicon Valley and of course, San Francisco. But Oakland has a proud history in policy and politics. As many of you know, the Black Panthers, historic Huey Newton and the wonderful Angela Davis have been incredible throughout history and changing. We're talking about changing laws and policy, and in some cases having to sacrifice their lives because of it. The Black Panther Party, among so many other activists, disability activists who were throughout the Bay Area. And Kamala Harris is so proud, Vice President Kamala Harris is so proud to represent Oakland, California, and the people of Oakland and Berkeley. And we're so proud of her. We got to see her up close and personal as she rose up and as she became a US Senator. And we are so incredibly proud to see her as the first African-American woman, as the first South Asian woman to be elected to national office. And so we're just really excited. And we, as Andy would say, we'll hold her accountable, just like we would hold anybody accountable, and make sure that she continues, as well as President Biden, continue to do work on behalf of people with disabilities, on behalf of all people from marginalized communities. But we are elated to have the first woman and the first woman vice president to be from the Bay Area, and specifically from Oakland, California.
Congratulations to all of us. Yay. Thank you.
Thank you. And we look forward to you joining us on Twitter.